Good morning. Can you all hear me okay there in the back? Okay, well those of you who have had classes with me know that I can't walk and stand still at the same time. So first of all, I want to thank the Society for the invitation. I'm humbled by the turnout today. I see current students and former students, and I see friends from the faculty, friends from the community, friends from the highly competitive Carrollton, Georgia 5K running scene. So I'm delighted. I'm humbled by this turnout. So here we go. For those of you who are here for extra credit, write this down. If your professors have asked you what you learned about during this talk today, this is what you learned about. I've made it easy for you. So here you go. My talk today is about the first Southerners, and I have to thank John for that title, which was much better than the terrible academic title I gave him. It's much catchier, so thank you for that. My talk today is sort of to hopefully give you guys an overview of Creek and Cherokee culture in Georgia. These are groups many of us are familiar with as two of the 5 civilized tribes. That may be the extent of our knowledge of Creek and Cherokee culture. That's really probably all we learned about in high school, so I hope to give you guys some more information today. But these are the 3 things that I hope you all take away, and in all seriousness. First of all, Creek and Cherokee, who we probably know best sort of as they appeared in the 18th and 19th century in Georgia. Those of you who have some familiarity with Creek and Cherokee culture, that's probably what your mental template is. You're probably thinking about what Creek and Cherokee looked like in the 18th and 19th century. Hopefully we'll expand that a bit today. But Creek and Cherokee share social and cultural and social institutions that go back several thousand years, that go back until at least 1000 AD. But, however, they used very different strategies to adapt to the biological, political, economic, and social changes of the colonial period. So after the arrival of the Spanish in the 1500s, and then after the arrival of the French and English colonists, all Native American groups in North America had to adapt, had to adjust to this new landscape of extreme social and biological change. People were hit with epidemic diseases. They became a part of a new global economy. These were incredible demographic, economic, biological, social changes. Creek and Cherokee adapted different strategies to adapt to these changes, and that helps explain some of the similarities and differences in their culture in the 18th and 19th centuries. And then finally, perhaps the most important thing, Creek and Cherokee are still here. I hang out with them. I received a text from a Cherokee guy this morning giving me a hard time about my talk today. So I want you to sort of, I hope this talk will also help dispel any romantic ideas you might have about vanishing Indians. Creek and Cherokee and other Southeastern Indians are very much alive and well today. I'd like to embarrass my students. How many of my archaeology field school students are here? Will you guys raise your hands? Okay, they're hanging out in the back. But my archaeology field school students have had the chance to work very closely with members of the Cherokee Tribal Historic Preservation Office. They can certainly vouch for the fact that these folks have not vanished. So that's our 3 take-home messages today. My talk today draws from several sources. I put this up here in part to direct you guys to some reading, those of you who'd like to learn more about Creek and Cherokee culture. But I'm really drawing on my graduate training at the University of Georgia, where we draw heavily on Charles Hudson's seminal ethnographic work with Southeastern Indians. I'd also point you to Robbie Etheridge, a great author on Creek studies. Theda Perdue, who's done excellent work on Cherokee gender. And then Barbara Duncan and Brett Riggs, who've done fantastic work with Cherokee archaeology and ethnohistory. My talk today will also be drawing on original archaeological research that I've done. I'll be talking about some of my own work and work that my students have done. And then also for me, about 10 years of experience now living and working in Cherokee, North Carolina, closely with the Eastern Band. So this is a talk that draws from academic sources, some original field research, and also just my own really sort of cultural anthropology experiences living and working in Cherokee. In my talk today, I'll give you guys just a little bit of history about me, a little bit of an introduction. I'll give a brief overview of Cherokee and Creek geography, culture, and history so we're all on the same page. And then I'll talk about archaeology. I'll talk about Creek and Cherokee origins. When did those identities, Creek and Cherokee, when did they develop? How did they develop? When did Native Americans first arrive in the Americas to begin with, right? So some sort of we'll talk about the deep origins of Creek and Cherokee culture. We'll talk about some of these shared cultural traditions. Again, while Creek and Cherokee speak different languages, had very different strategies to adapt to the social and economic changes of the colonial period. They share these very deep cultural, political, economic traditions that go way back in the Southeast. And then I'll sort of end by just kind of reminding you that Creek and Cherokee are here today. I'm going to point you to some Creek and Cherokee websites that are pretty cool. So there you go. So how did I grow up to become an archaeologist, right? It's dangerous stuff. When I was an undergraduate at Wake Forest University, I couldn't get a Spanish class my first semester, and I took an anthropology class instead. And like many of you, I didn't know what anthropology was. But I walked into my anthropology class, and our professor was an ornery Texan who wore Western shirts and dirty jeans and boots every day when he came to class. And that was just, I was like, man, this is it. This is it. This is what I want to do. I want to have a job where I get to be a social scientist, but I get to work outside, and I get to wear jeans to work. My students don't recognize me today. I don't normally look like this, right? But I did. Fall of my freshman year, I was set on a dark, dark path toward archaeology. When I graduated in 2003, I began what I call my Forrest Gump years, where I just I just very fortunately fell into really, really good archaeological projects. I just landed on one really interesting archaeological project after another. I worked as a contract archaeologist for a cultural resource management company that primarily worked in Western North Carolina, and I had the very good fortune to work on projects collaboratively with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. So almost all of my archaeological experience, professionally and academically, has been to work cooperatively with a Native American group. And that's really informed my archaeological career. This is an article from American Archaeology magazine in 2009 covering a huge archaeological research project in Cherokee. I was part of a team that excavated what became the footprint for the Cherokee K-12 school complex. It was a 40-acre excavation, largest excavation in the history of North Carolina. We found over 100 well-preserved woodland and Cherokee structures. Fascinating site, but we also worked very closely with the tribe. This is a picture of the principal chief of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, Michelle Hicks, with Tasha Benishek, our project supervisor. Anthropologists and archaeologists and Native Americans have not always gotten along so well, and there's a lot of good reasons for that, frankly. But this was and continues to be just a real touchstone, a fantastic example of what good collaborative archaeology can look like. So I was fortunate to be sort of raised in that sort of collaborative tradition, and I've been around enough there now that they may be the poster boy for Cherokee archaeology. I've developed a great relationship with the Eastern Band, and this last summer I had the good fortune to take my students up there. These are some shots of our West Georgia students working at our archaeology field school in Cherokee, North Carolina. They're working side by side with enrolled members of the Eastern Band, like my friend Bo Carroll here, who is our field supervisor. In addition to learning archaeological field methods, such as excavation, survey with a laser transit, we also had the opportunity to speak with and learn from Cherokee elders like Jerry Wolf. Jerry Wolf is a Cherokee beloved man. That's sort of the most revered status a male Cherokee can attain in Cherokee culture. He's also a World War II vet. He was at D-Day. Really, really interesting guy. But Jerry actually lived up the hill from the site where we were working on, and he would just come by and talk to us sometimes. And so this was a really remarkable experience for me and my students. But this is the kind of work I do now. Another shot from our field school, again, sort of showing this collaboration. Our site was open to the Cherokee community. Here we have Cherokee visitors being led by one of our archaeological volunteers. This is Damon Allen. Damon's a member of the Eastern Band. He's actually a high school student, but he does archaeology every summer, and he would lead site tours for us and stuff. And here are our dirty field school students. You know, they're really doing archaeology. So that's sort of how I got here and what I'm doing today. So to really get into the talk now, I want to begin by giving sort of an overview of Creek and Cherokee history and geography and culture. For some of you who have an interest in this stuff, it may be a review. For a lot of you, this may be the first you've ever heard of this. So if you're here for extra credit, write this stuff down too. There you go. Okay. When many of you think about Creek and Cherokee culture in Georgia, you may think about some of the perhaps famous individuals, Creek and Cherokee individuals from the 18th and 19th century. How many of you are familiar with William Mcintosh? Right, there you go. Okay, right, there, good. So William Mcintosh was a Creek Indian chief who in 1825 was part of a small group that signed a treaty with the U.S. illegally without the authorization of the rest of the Creek Confederacy, giving away lots of land. He was very much murdered. He was murdered many times, for doing that, and I'll explain why here in a minute. Mary Musgrove was also Creek, a vital player in the founding of Savannah, was an important diplomat in Native American and colonial relationships in Savannah. John Ross, of course, was the chief of the Cherokee Nation during removal during 1838, and tried using diplomatic and legal recourses to keep the Cherokee in their native homeland. The Cherokee actually had a constitution that the U.S. Supreme Court acknowledged and that the state of Georgia refused to acknowledge, and that Andrew Jackson openly defied by sending them to removal. So thanks, Andrew Jackson. Okay. And we have here also, again, images you may have. This is the Cherokee cabin photographed in 1888, showing Cherokee as they begin to take on certain elements of European and American culture, log-style cabins, some Western dress, but still practicing native land use practices. They're growing corn, beans, and squash in an intercropping pattern right by their household. They're still pounding maize in the old-fashioned way. There you go. Some more sort of famous individuals you might be aware of. Nancy Ward, very famous Cherokee beloved woman. Beloved woman is an honorary title among the Cherokee. She was born in Chota in Tennessee, among the Overhill Cherokee. Her travels took her to Georgia, where she fought at the Battle of Taliwa against Creek, picked up her brother's rifle when he was shot, wasted a couple of Creeks, and rose to prominence as a Cherokee war woman. Stickamafuchi, famous Creek leader, and then this great image that I've seen plastered all over West Georgia. I mean the region. Like I saw this in Sandy Springs the other day with our kids. This is a picture of three Cherokee chiefs who, in 1762, actually traveled to London, traveled to England, as the British and the Cherokee were making allegiance. So perhaps you guys are familiar with some of these famous individuals. This is a map from the Smithsonian's Handbook of North American Indians that shows sort of the territorial extent of the Creek Confederacy and the Cherokee territory in the 18th century. You have to take maps like this with a grain of salt. During the colonial period, territorial boundaries controlled by Native American groups were changing quite a bit, but in general, this gives us a pretty good idea of where the Creek and Cherokee were living in the 18th century. And you may notice right off the bat that the Creek Confederacy is very large, right? I mean, it's a large group, a huge territorial extent. Most of Alabama, quite a bit of West Georgia. As I'll explain in some more detail, the Creek Confederacy is a really large, multi-ethnic, multi-lingual group of people. The Creek Confederacy is essentially made up of Native Americans who had survived wars with the British in the early 1700s, who came together roughly around Columbus, Georgia, and formed a confederacy, formed a sort of coalescent society of refugees. They created this new culture. They created this new political organization in the 18th century. So it's the 18th century when the Creek as we know them are sort of born. The Cherokee in the 18th century still controlled much of their ancestral territory in western North Carolina, northern Georgia, northern South Carolina, East Tennessee. For the Cherokee, there's more cultural continuity. They actually were able to maintain territory that they had controlled for thousands of years. That Cherokee identity, in a sense, is a little bit older than the Creek identity, but they're both representing these sort of groups that are adapting and surviving in the face of the colonial encounter. Okay. I have to put more text up for the Creek because it's more complicated. I don't remember this stuff as well, so you'll have to forgive all my text here. But again, we've got this map here showing the two major divisions of the Creek and the territories they controlled. In the 18th century, there were two groups of Creek, the Upper Creek and the Lower Creek. The Upper Creek were centered on the Tallapoosa River in Alabama. The Lower Creek were centered sort of around Columbus, Georgia, on the Chattahoochee River. And anthropologists and archaeologists have again referred to the Creek as a coalescent society. The best way, the simplest way to think about Creek identity is that this is a huge group made up of people who share a lot of common cultural traditions of Southeastern Indians, who came together as sort of refugees and formed a confederacy as a way to sort of create a political and military and economic unit that could compete with other groups like the Cherokee and also compete and deal with groups like the British and the French. Does that make sense to you guys? So you have all these refugees of war kind of coming together, forming a new society based on older cultural and social institutions. Why do we call them Creek? It actually, obviously Creek is an English word, and it was the word that English colonists living in South Carolina used for the Native Americans who were living near Macon, Georgia. How many of you have been to Okmulgee, or the Macon Plateau site, right? Okay, so that was also a trading post. Much of the Creek Confederacy takes up residence there in Macon, Georgia in the late 18th century. Late 18th century. And it's there they get that name Creek Indians that sticks. The Creek, again, we have the upper creeks along the Coosa, Tallapoosa, and Alabama rivers, the lower creeks on the Chattahoochee River. They all spoke Muscogean languages, but they all spoke different but mutually intelligible Muscogean languages. So the Coosa Creek are speaking a slightly different language than the Tallapoosa Creek, who are speaking a slightly different language than your Coweta Creek. A very complex kind of cultural configuration here. The Cherokee, on the other hand, have sort of deeper roots, at least sort of spatially. You have more people who are sort of stayed in the same place for the same amount of time. In the 18th century, we have good documentation, good historical and archaeological documentation, that the Cherokee lived in 5 groups of towns in the southern Appalachian Mountain region. Down here in South Carolina and into Georgia a little bit, right on the Savannah River, we have the lower towns. Moving into North Carolina along the Valley River, we have the valley towns. The middle towns. If you've ever driven up 441 along the Little Tennessee River from, say, Dillard, Georgia, up into Franklin, North Carolina, you have driven through the middle towns. I mean, you are right there. You are in the middle towns. The out towns today represent settlements along the Tuckasegee and Oconaluftee rivers. Cherokee, North Carolina is located right here near Danunyi. The Mound of Gadua is where the Cherokee emerged from in their oral tradition. So these out towns are very, very central to the Cherokee. And then in the 18th century, Cherokee actually moved over and took over former settlements here on the other side of the mountain in what became called the Overhill towns. These are all well documented in the 18th century. Around 1760, 1775, the British and the emerging American military wages a series of really, really brutal campaigns against the Cherokee. The Cherokee towns are completely burned twice. Most of them are burned around the 1760s and again right around 1776. The Cherokee, in response, moved out of their ancestral territory and down into Georgia. So this Cherokee Nation around New Etowah and this Cherokee settlement in northwest Georgia is a later and relatively short-lived phenomenon. They're not actually here around New Etowah for all that long. So say around 1775, 1780, Cherokees start moving down south to avoid that, to sort of recover from those British attacks. Some folks go to East Tennessee with their kin, but quite a few folks move down here and establish New Etowah. The Cherokee Nation is a coherent nation from 1819 until 1838 when we have the Removal Act and the removal of the Indians. So again, that presence there in Georgia around New Etowah, very important, but actually a relatively short-lived phenomenon, historically and archaeologically speaking. So that's the Creek and the Cherokee in the 17th and 18th century. in the 19th century. That's how most of us think about Creek and Cherokee. But where do they come from in the first place? And I'm going to go way back here. I'm going to go back about 15,000 years to when Native Americans first come to North America. And I'm going to borrow this great one-liner from a Waring speaker we had visit us in 2012, Dr. Ted Gable at Texas A&M University. And he reminds us that the North America, so our continent, was populated around 15,000 years ago from Siberia, not Iberia. So there are some folks who argue that Native Americans may have come over from Europe, from the Atlantic coast, and there's a Solutrean hypothesis that says that Clovis points look like European points, and there's really no good evidence for that. It's a bunch of hooey. There you go. What we know from all the genetic and all the archaeological data point clearly to North America being populated by a group of basically Siberian immigrants who are chasing big game on foot and probably also on sea, coming over by boat. They come into the Americas. We now have good genetic evidence showing that most Native Americans are part of this first migration, probably around 15,000 years ago. We can see that in the haplogroup markers. There's also another genetic wave of later groups that come in and populate Alaska, it looks like. So we know that 15,000 years ago, give or take, this is where Native Americans come from. They bring with them and create Clovis technology, a remarkably effective big game hunting technology. This is the end of the Ice Age. These guys are hunting mammoth and mastodon. Hard way to make a living, but they're doing it, and they're doing it well. The Clovis Horizon, and my colleagues in the anthropology department, Dr. Smallwood and Dr. Jennings, are experts in Clovis. If you want to have them for another one of these talks, it should be really, I'll make a plug for Ashley and Tom. They can tag team it. It'll be fun. There we go. But they brought this big game technology, and very quickly Native Americans filled up our continent. At the end of the Ice Age, as the big game die off, people begin to adapt their hunting technology to smaller game. White-tailed deer replaces mammoth and mastodon as your primary protein source. People are hunting smaller game. And we begin to see changes in projectile point technology as people are moving away from Clovis spears to throwing and thrusting spears that are a little bit smaller. People begin to take advantage of local raw material. And archaeologists can use these changing projectile point styles to understand changes in subsistence and behavior, but they also change over time in a predictable way, so we can use them to date archaeology sites. So how many of you have ever found arrowheads when you're out like walking fields and collecting stuff? Right, so those are valuable to us as archaeologists as ways to understand subsistence and also understand when places were being populated. And here around Carrollton, by 8,000 years ago, we've got a really healthy population of hunter-gatherers. By 3,000, 4,000 years ago, we basically have almost sedentary hunter-gatherers who are setting up shop. If you find these little sort of small triangular projectile points in your backyard, those are called Morrow Mountain points, and they're extremely common because people were just all over the place here 3,000, 4,000 years ago. Technologies continue to change. We see the invention of container and cooking technology here in the Southeast during the late Archaic period, about 4,000 years ago. People make soapstone bowls for indirect heating, and we get the invention of pottery around 2500 BC here in Georgia. Pottery is first made with fiber temper, and the first ceramic type we identify in the Southeast is actually from Georgia, Stallings Island, Georgia. Stallings Island pottery. So, claim to fame for us here in Georgia. We've got the first pottery. By 500 BC, populations are expanding. People are becoming more and more sedentary. They're beginning to do some sort of beginning agriculture, horticulture, and we see Native American groups across the eastern woodlands getting involved in long-distance trade and exchange. These are not isolated little populations just living in their little hamlets. These are people who are exchanging information and exchanging goods over huge distances. The Hopewell Phenomenon is this regional trade network centered around Ohio that expands down into parts of Georgia and much of the Southeast. Here in Georgia, people were making really beautiful pottery and trading it up into Ohio in exchange for different kinds of stone sources. So Native Americans here were never isolated. They didn't have the internet, but they were connected, right? I mean, they had social networks. And social networks there weren't things like Twitter. Social networks were things like you were trading mica for pottery and getting involved in these really interesting regional exchange networks. But the real roots, the places where archaeologists can really begin to see these first glimmers of what would become Creek and Cherokee culture, happened during what archaeologists call the Mississippian Period. And the Mississippian Period across the Southeast, so I'm talking here about everything east of the Mississippi and south of, say, Virginia or so, is this period of time that dates from about 1000 AD until about 1600, about contact with the Spanish, when Native American populations in the Southeast begin living in centralized villages. They begin building platform mounds as central places to mark their territories, and also to serve as platforms for the house of elite. Chiefs begin living on top of houses. And it's during this time in the Southeast when we actually see the rise of quite a bit of social inequality, a lot of political centralization, and a lot of hierarchy. There are haves and have-nots. It's not as bad as the 1%. There's no Warren Buffett or anything like that, but we are beginning to see that, political centralization, one person in charge of other people, people that have power over life and death, and economic inequality emerging during this time period, and a set of rituals and beliefs that become widely shared across the Southeast, and that form the sort of basis, if you will, of a lot of really important Creek and Cherokee cultural practices. And to illustrate what the Mississippian Period looks like, I'm going to use a convenient example about one hour north of us, which is the Etowah Mounds site. How many of you have been to Etowah? Oh, excellent, very good. Do they make you go in 5th grade? Do you they should if they don't, right? Okay. So we'll take a look here at the site of Etowah. Etowah is occupied for actually longer than this, but it reaches its peak around 1200 or 1350 AD. Between 1200 and 1350 AD, Etowah was the center of a large polity, the center of a large chiefdom. There would have been a chief at Etowah who was in control of a territory roughly 1 day's walk in diameter. So as far as you could walk in about 4 hours or so, moving at a good clip, that was the extent of the chiefdom at Etowah. That's a pretty big distance geographically. There are 3 large mounds at Etowah. If you've been, Mound A, B, and C, a large plaza area. This is a highly organized architectural plan, full of sort of symbolism, much of which was aimed at sort of asserting the status of the chief. Nice overhead view there. If you haven't been to the site, there's actually a really big fish weir at Etowah. People would trap fish there that helped feed the population. Also lots of great farmland where they would have farmed their corn, and nearby forests for hunting white-tailed deer. Archaeologists have reconstructed the growth of Etowah. It begins as a relatively modest mound site with some public buildings out in the plaza area, and grows into a fortified site with a large ditch surrounding the site for defensive fortification, formal plaza, mounds for the chief to live on. I mean, really impressive, very sort of hierarchical site here. Artist reconstruction of Etowah, and it would have been a booming metropolis of sorts. And some pictures of daily life there. Crowded, bustling place. Kids and dogs running around. Etowah is famous for 2 marble statues. These are actually carved out of marble, local Georgia marble, that were carved and painted, representing a male and female figures. These were found sort of buried haphazardly in a mound. It's thought that the last chief of Etowah may have come to a violent end. The site may have actually been attacked, and the temple mound may have been sacked by another chiefdom. So that's a possibility. There's lots of warfare in the Mississippian Period, but we can get a sense of what these folks look like, and these are thought to carry some cosmological meaning as well. Okay. Many famous artifacts from Etowah include this cold-hammered copper plate of what archaeologists call an eagle dancer or a falcon warrior. cold hammering copper is no joke. That's not easy. This is really skilled craftsmanship we're looking at. And these copper plates from Etowah also carry with them important images sort of explaining and showing symbolism for the Native Americans who lived there. Much of the iconography on this plate falls under a set of related icons that we call the Southeastern ceremonial complex. Things like a forked eye motif around the eye. This guy is carrying a mace. He's got a headdress. He's holding a severed head there, showing his status and power as a warrior. So we have a lot of information about these religious and cosmological and social ideas from the Mississippian period that carry over into Creek and Cherokee culture. Okay. And during the 16th century, so when the Spanish arrive, we have these great accounts from Spanish explorers like De Soto and Juan Pardo. And what they're encountering as they move through the southeast, as they move through Georgia, are these very politically centralized chiefdoms. What this map shows is mound sites with the dots here are mound sites. The shaded in circles are the territories they controlled in the 16th century when De Soto was coming through. De Soto encountered and recorded the chiefdoms of Akuti and Confederacy and also Coosa. For good measure, I put the Cherokee up here as well. He actually does an end around Cherokee territory and doesn't run into these guys. But he hears about the Chalaki. He hears about the Cherokee here in the 16th century. This is the landscape that De Soto encounters. Very different kind of social organization and political organization than we're going to see with the Creek and Cherokee. I mean, these are very powerful, very centralized, hierarchical political entities. I mean, the paramount chiefdom of Coosa, which was actually centered in Floyd County, Georgia, covers a huge territory. I mean, all the folks that lived here would have declared allegiance to Coosa. They would have considered that their chiefdom, their polity. I mean, it's a very centralized political organization. Okay. In the 1500s and up until about 1700s, we then enter what some archaeologists have labeled rather pessimistically the forgotten centuries. This is a period of time when we don't have historical records. The Spanish leave. It's a while before the English come back in and sort of set up shop again. And so we have this period of a little over 100 years when we don't know much about how Native American culture is changing in the Southeast. It's one of the things that we're most interested in as archaeologists because we know what it looks like when De Soto's here in 1540. We have these very hierarchical, politically organized, socially unequal chiefdoms. And then we know what things look like in the 18th century. We know what the Creek and Cherokee look like. They're actually more egalitarian. People have more political autonomy. There are some different social and cultural institutions. Much of my research, like pretty much every other Southeastern archaeology who works in the contact period, is focused on is trying to figure out how societies are changing during these years. This is a crucial time period. So for those of you who are interested in this, students who want to go on to graduate school, this is still a really active area of research. Many of us are trying to figure out, what's going on during this time, and we can use archaeology to do that. We don't have historic records, but people are still leaving behind material records of their past behaviors, and we can try and understand this really important period of time as Native American communities adapt to and respond to epidemic diseases and warfares. They build on older social and cultural institutions, but they're creating new societies. They're creating new social formations by the time the British arrive and begin writing things down again in the 1700s. So to bring us back to the 18th century, we've got our map here. We've got the Creek Confederacy. Again, this is the 18th century landscape, large sprawling Creek Confederacy, and the smaller, sort of more centralized Cherokee territory. What are some shared cultural traditions? Well, in the 18th and 19th century, there are some really interesting similarities between the Creek and Cherokee that point to their common cultural origins in the Mississippian period. What we see instead of chiefdoms and instead of these really centralized polities are groups of towns. People declared allegiance to groups of towns. So if you were a Cherokee in the 18th century and somebody asked you where you were from, you would say, I'm from Birdtown, or I'm from Quallatown, or I'm from Tellico, or I'm from Quanasee. You would associate with your town. Above that, you would associate with your group of towns. I'm from Quanasi in the valley towns. I'm from Niquosi in the middle towns. And so for Cherokee and for Creek alike, their real political allegiance was to their town group. The Europeans couldn't stand that. First of all, there's no chief. You know, like when the aliens arrive and say, "Take me to your leader," there is no leader, right? Leadership is by council, by headmen who don't have much authority. So things are not like they used to be. There's no one Creek king. There's no one Cherokee king. This crazy Scot, Alexander Cumming, arrives in Cherokee country in the 1700s and tries to create a Cherokee emperor. He names a Cherokee emperor. Nobody takes him seriously because it's stupid. They don't do it that way, right? Okay. So you have a lot of political autonomy. People are loyal to their town, to their group of towns. When Cherokee and Creek are dealing with the English and French, they're concerned about their town. How will trade with the French affect my town? Not the whole Cherokee Nation, not the whole Creek Nation. And that makes political negotiation really interesting and very difficult. There's a matrilineal kinship system and a clan system. This is a very old social institution for the Creek and Cherokee. You reckoned descent along your mother's line. It didn't mean you didn't know who your dad was and that you didn't like him. I'm sure you liked him very much. But in terms of your kinship, you reckoned your descent and your kinship through your mother's line. When a young couple was married, a man would go and live with his wife's family. There's some suggestion this may have actually been a really good kind of way to integrate society, because men are jerks and they're always starting trouble. They're always starting fights and warfare. So when you take the jerks and you put them all in their wives' families' houses, it keeps them under control a little bit. And it keeps them from going to war with other towns in the same town unit, because they don't want to start a scuffle with their brother, right? So there's actually, it's a useful thing there. And there's a clan system. People would identify with different clans that helped integrate these different towns. There's rules of marriage that help integrate these towns. Strong division of gender roles that are tied to a kind of cold season and warm season tradition. Men primarily hunted and went to war. Those were male activities that you did mostly in the wintertime. Women primarily farmed. Those are more sort of warm season activities. This was a really important component of gender identity for Creek and Cherokee. What you did was a really important part of your gender. The American government never got this, and they were really trying to shove Euro-American styles of farming on the Creek and Cherokee, where you make the man a yeoman farmer, right? You make the man the head of household and he's a farmer. And the men are saying, that's women's work. What in the world? You want me to farm corn? And women are saying, hey, you're taking away my subsistence base. What's wrong with you? So of course that was disastrous, but there you go. Blood revenge and a style of warfare called cutting off warfare. In traditional Creek and Cherokee culture, and we think this goes back to the Mississippian period, if a member of your clan or your town was killed, you had the right and the obligation to go kill a member of the offending clan or their town, and then it was done. Then it was over. There was not this kind of European total warfare. The idea, for Creek and Cherokee, the idea of burning down a village or totally obliterating another people was just insane. You didn't do that. If somebody had a beef with you, you went and you killed them, and then it was done. It was over. And every year, there was an annual ceremony called the Green Corn Ceremony, where all outstanding debts were forgiven and resolved. And it really limited violence in these societies. Warfare was conducted in the cutting off manner, kind of ambush warfare, small parties going out for war. It was an important part of male identity. It was an important part of status achievement. It was one way to achieve status as a male. But it was not this kind of total warfare. And so Creek and Cherokee were just, when they encountered Europeans who burned down villages and killed women and kids, they said, what in the world is this? This is not right, right? And then in terms of cosmology and belief system, there is a notion that things need to be in balance, that maintaining balance is important, that the world is made up of three parts: an upper world where there are supernatural beings, this world where we live, and the lower world. You enter the lower world, by the way, through water or whirlpools or caves and tunnels, and so that's where the scary things live, is down there. And Creek and Cherokee sort of shared that tradition. When we look in the 18th and 19th century, The Creek and Cherokee are adapting different strategies to try and create coherent societies in the face of colonialism. The Creek, this big multi-ethnic, multilingual community, keep in mind, you're bringing in people who speak different languages, who have some different cultural traditions, develop a lot of new kinds of social institutions. So we can look, for example, at architecture. This is a Mississippian period mound and plaza complex. It's the one at Etowah. You've got a large mound, large open plaza area, domestic habitation surrounding it. The Creek creates something different called the square ground. It's this sort of rectangular plaza within a small set of square buildings and a circular building. It evokes the mound and plaza complex a little bit, but it's kind of a new thing. The Cherokee maintain a more traditional kind of look. They have a townhouse that is really, I think, a representation of that mound. It's still elevated a little bit, and then a big plaza area, and then you're surrounded by habitation sites, or habitation residences, dwellings. So Creek are sort of inventing some new ideas about architecture and about society, whereas Cherokee, who've been able to maintain their land base for longer, are kind of drawing on these deeper memories, this kind of deeper sense of cultural identity to integrate their communities. A few other kind of point-by-point comparisons we can make, and I think I've hit most of these, but again, just to reiterate, as they're trying to survive and thrive in the face of the colonial encounter in the 18th century, the Creek have this big confederacy, a multilingual, multi-ethnic group. The Cherokee are still in their groups of towns where you have a lot of cultural continuity, where you probably have some of the same people who have survived the epidemics of the 1600s, 1700s, and are still maintaining their ancestral territory. The Creek really try to go to war to defend their territory. They try to go to war with the British and the Americans. And how many of you are familiar with the Red Sticks War? So it's history majors in the house. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so the Creek are really divided as to whether to try and negotiate with the British and American governments or go to war. There is sort of an outbreak of a civil war among the Creek. The Red Sticks are the ones who want to go to war. The White Sticks are the ones who don't. And the Creek really take the fight to the new colonial governments and unfortunately are not successful. The Cherokee see this happening, and they say, okay, we think we're not going to try the violence route. We think this is not working. And so the Cherokee really try and use diplomacy to maintain their ancestral lands. The Cherokee, in a very adaptive way, take on a lot of elements of European government. They create a constitution. They develop a legislative branch and an executive branch. They draft a constitution down here in Georgia. Up in North Carolina, the Eastern Band, who are, I think, the most politically savvy group of people I've ever met in my entire life, the Eastern Band decided to become North Carolina citizens to stay in the state of North Carolina. And they very carefully negotiate with the state of North Carolina to maintain their lands. They are not on the same page as these guys down in Georgia. They are not on the same page. They are negotiating very carefully in their own backyard to try and keep their ancestral lands, and they are ultimately successful in doing that, which is just remarkable. The Treaty of Indian Springs in 1826, which Mcintosh signed, sort of paves the way for Creek removal, and the Treaty of New Echota, which the sort of infamous treaty party signs without Cherokee consent in 1835, paves the way for the removal of the Cherokee. What we see, again, just to recap here, though, is this kind of selective adoption of European culture and political organization. The Cherokee especially are very savvy. They sort of take on some elements of European governmental organization while maintaining a lot of their own cultural identity. There's always this balance between warfare and diplomacy, and the Creek sort of try first to go with warfare and ultimately don't do quite as well as the Cherokee do going with diplomacy. And we have this sort of broader theme also of on the one hand, developing new social institutions to integrate newcomers, to develop a new society, versus falling back on sort of social memory and cultural continuity to maintain a sense of identity in the face of these dramatic changes. But I want to close, I want to close with this important fact, which is that removal was not the end of Creek and Cherokee culture. So in 1838, Creek and Cherokee and other Southeastern Indians are removed from the Southeast on the Trail of Tears, And that's often where, in our history books, the story kind of ends. That's where we stop talking about these cultures. But of course, they persist on. The Creek and the Cherokee and other Southeastern Indians form new governments in Oklahoma, in Indian Territory, which are successful and continue to persist today. The Eastern Band of Cherokee stay in their homeland in North Carolina and are still there today. This is a shot from the Conference of the Leaders of the United South and Eastern Tribes in Washington, D.C. So here are Creek and Cherokee and Choctaw and Chickasaw and Seminole representatives there in our nation's capital, advocating on behalf of their people. Cherokee today really have this deep appreciation for their culture and their heritage, but they're also very much modern people living in a modern world. Here's Chief Hicks looking very dapper in a suit, along with the Warriors of Anigadua. This is a traditional Cherokee dance group that reenacts Cherokee dances, keeping these cultural traditions alive. And you should check out the Muscogee Creek Nation website. It's pretty slick. You can learn about Muscogee Creek tradition and heritage, current events, scholarships for Creek students. Likewise, the Eastern Cherokee have their own website as well. They have Head Start programs for their kids, Healthy Choices programs going on. So these are very living, vibrant communities. You can get to Cherokee in about 3.5 hours. Go check it out. There's a great museum. It's a good place to visit. Go eat at Paul's Diner. Get the trout. It's really good. Okay. And again, in closing, for those of you who are interested in learning more about these topics, I would start with Charles Hudson and then his students. Charles Hudson, Robbie Etheridge, Cedar Purdue, Barbara Duncan and Brett Riggs, all excellent ethnohistorians who can provide you with excellent, good information about Southeastern Native Americans. And if you want a really, really stirring read, I tell folks who want to learn about Southeastern Indians, if you can only read one book, read Knights of Spain, Warriors of the Sun by Charles Hudson. It's a reconstruction of the DeSoto expedition using archaeology and ethnohistory to try and just paint this portrait of what the Southeast looked like between 1500 and 1800. Absolutely fantastic read. So check that out. That's all I've got. I did want to show you my students one more time because I'm very proud of them. There they are. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I think I saved a little bit of time for questions. So I'll take questions. Can I speak briefly about the Cherokee Indian mystery trees? No, I cannot, because I do not know enough about them to speak to them. But thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
My family moved into the Grange, Georgia area around 1834.
Okay.
And could you sort of make some comments as to what was going on with Indians around 1833, 1834?
Okay, good question. So I've got a gentleman up front who's got family that moved into LaGrange around 1834 or so. LaGrange, 1834, that's a time when the creek would have been getting ready for removal. Some would have already been removed. And so you would have been in a situation where there are probably going to be some abandoned creek farmsteads and homesteads, and probably that's the kind of landscape your family might have moved into. I'll point out, too, that's another really important thing, is that in the 1830s, all of the modifications and improvements that Cherokee and Creek had made to this land, it was still there. It was not some kind of barren wilderness or landscape. Cherokee had been farming. They built schools and homes and churches. So had the Creek. And so people are actually moving into a landscape that's had a lot of modification. But that's probably what it looked like, more or less. Good question. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Which health? Oh, the Tallapoosa health, please. Okay. Okay, cool. Sure. I've got a general question about a soapstone quarry here in Carrollton. There's actually several. There are several, but you'll sometimes find in some of the areas around Carrollton soapstone quarries where Native Americans would have gone to mine soapstone. And they would have been doing that for, I mean, really thousands of years. That's a practice that would have gone back 5,000, 6,000 years. They're using soapstone to make bowls, to make stones for heating water in pots, tempering ceramics. So that's a thousands of years old practice. And there are definitely some well-used soapstone quarries around here. Yeah. They would have been ancestors of Creeks. They would have been Creek ancestors. Yeah, Patrick.
Yeah, what's the state of the Creek languages today, or language in the Cherokee?
Excellent question. What's the state of Creek and Cherokee language? There are more fluent speakers of Muscogee in Oklahoma, and there are more fluent speakers of Cherokee in Oklahoma than there are in the East. So those groups that were removed actually maintain the language pretty well. And don't quote me on the Creek figure. I think there are at least hundreds, if not a few thousand, Muscogee speakers. In Oklahoma, there are a couple of thousand fluent Cherokee speakers. In North Carolina, there are currently only about 200 fluent Cherokee speakers. But they're starting some new programs. There's an immersion preschool where the kids go at like age 2 and just speak Cherokee. And they're beginning to collaborate with the Western Cherokee to get full-time teachers in who can really help that program. Great question, Patrick. Yes, sir.
I've read that on the weekends, the Indians down there on the river would come up to the square and shop. In the square, right here in Carrollton.
What year would that have been, sir? What year would that have been, roughly?
1820.
Okay, so I've got a report here that in the 1820s you would have had Native Americans actually coming up into Carrollton to use the square. How would they have traveled?
And they buy one auto.
What would that be?
Didn't mention.
They would just buy something. Yeah, I mean, folks at that point probably doing it on horseback. They could have been coming on foot, also by canoe potentially. That's good.
Are you interested in one of those trail marking trees? Still living? That's the kind
I got a question. If I'm interested in the trail marker trees, yeah, you can come see me after the talk. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, is there any excavation or plans to do stuff on, I believe it's the Snake Creek ground, is that right, near Cherokee?
So there was a mound located fairly close to Carrollton on Snake Creek. This is near it's near Banning Mills actually. That mound was completely excavated. Unfortunately, it's been completely destroyed by early excavations and farming. However, that would be a great place to do research. There aren't currently any plans, but that would be a great place for students from West Georgia to go out and do work potentially. So, great question. Yes, sir.
Another comment about that picture there, the obesity. Their ancestors.
Those are mostly West Georgia. Sir, those are West Georgia students mostly. I've got a general question about obesity and health. There is a problem with obesity in a lot of Native American communities, and in general, it's the same problem in a lot of low-income communities where there's a lot of easy access to high-calorie foods and less access to good quality foods. But the Cherokee are really actively working on health programs to fight diabetes and obesity in their communities. So there's a lot of good work going on with that, including work that takes traditional Cherokee ideas about medicine and health and incorporates that into fighting obesity and diabetes. So, good question. Anything else? Yes, sir. The question is Chief Mcintosh actually buried in the grave at Mcintosh Reserve? And I don't know. I would hope so, but I don't know. I can take one more, and then I got to go teach my class. So I'll take one more question. Yeah.
Just an observation. The Western band, in association with the Chief Museum in Rome, comes here and teaches the Cherokee culture course. At least once a year.
They do it at the museum?
Usually at Berry College or one of the the place I went to
Okay, so if you guys are interested, I've got a report from Stanley here that the Western Cherokee come over once a year and collaborate with the Chieftains Museum up in Rome to do some culture classes. So if you're interested in that, see Stanley. Okay, I hate to do it, but I really do have to go. But thank you very much.